Today marks the last message in the series, and this week it occurred to me that we haven't even attempted to answer a very basic question when it comes to the subject of worry, of this kind of fear. And that is the question, where did it start? I mean, where does this fear, where does it all come from? And some of you maybe are sitting here thinking, well, it all started in junior high when that bully used to beat on some of us, and so I was always looking over my shoulder and worried about, some guy beating on me. Or maybe others of you are saying, well, it all started about a month ago when my employer broke the news that the company was downsizing, and I, at that point in time, didn't know how much longer I was going to have a job. Yeah, I mean, there's different possible answers like that might be going through your minds, but that's not really what I'm asking. I'm asking for us to go further back than that. Where did fear come from? I mean, everything had a beginning, right? I mean, the one exception to that is God. God didn't have a beginning. The Bible tells us that He is the Alpha and the Omega. He has always been and always will be. And so, there was no beginning with God. But otherwise, everything else had a beginning. And that includes what we're talking about, this subject of fear, this subject of worry and anxiety. It all had a beginning. And in order to find the beginning on that, you actually need to turn no further than the early pages of the Bible, because you actually see it there. Without turning there, you know that Genesis chapters 1 and 2 record for us the creation account where God spoke into existence all that exists. On day 6, He created human beings. I mean, you know that account. Chapter 1, chapter 2 of Genesis. Adam and Eve, they had it good. They had everything that was going their way. They had a special relationship with God. There was no pain, no suffering, none of that kind of stuff even entered into the equation. But then you turn to chapter 3 of Genesis, and all of a sudden everything goes south. And it's because Adam and Eve chose to disobey God. They made a conscious decision, a decision of disobedience. And with that decision, there were all kinds of consequences that came into effect as a result. It's interesting that in the middle of chapter 3 is where we see fear for the very first time. It was after sin. After sin entered into the equation. Adam and Eve, they're still in the Garden of Eden. They haven't been kicked out of the Garden of Eden. By the end of the chapter, they're out of the Garden of Eden, but in the middle of the chapter, they're still there. As a matter of fact, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 8, we read this. This is after Adam and Eve had sinned. It says, "Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze, and they hid themselves from the Lord God among the trees of the garden." And in the verses that follow that, then we hear these words coming from God's mouth. God is saying, "Where are you?" As He's walking in the garden. Where are you? Now, God knows all things. God knew full well where they were. But nonetheless, He was asking the question, where are you? And Adam spoke up on behalf of Adam and Eve. And with this response in verse 10, he said, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid." Very first time we ever see fear. A part of the human equation, a part of our experience, fear. There it is. And from that day forward, it's been a part of our struggle ever since. In fact, in many ways, you could say that fear in one form or another is kind of hardwired into us, into our DNA. At least that's the way it seems, doesn't it? Because fear in one form or another sometimes just seems to dominate our lives. Now, we've been exposed to many verses in the Bible, whether it be through this series of messages, which today is the fifth and final message in the series. Whether it be through this series of messages or it be through other studies or other times that we've been spending reading in the Bible, we've all been exposed to verses in the Bible that address the subject. And boy, they can bring great comfort, like what Jesus said on the last full day of his life in John chapter 14, right before he was going to end up being arrested later that day and crucified the next day. He said these words, "Don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God, trust also in me." And what was inspiring Jesus to say that is that the disciples were clearly understanding the fact that Jesus was going to be taken from them and they weren't going to continue to be with Jesus. And that was troubling them. That was stirring up anxiety in them. And so Jesus said that. It's a great passage. It's a passage that a lot of us have looked to and we've drawn strength from. Or how about this one? This was one of the memory verses earlier in our series, Psalm 34, verse 4, where it says, "I sought the Lord and he answered me and delivered me from all of my fears." It's a good verse. It's a very good verse. Meaningful, encouraging. Or this one, which is our memory verse for this week, Isaiah 41, verse 10, says, "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be afraid, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will hold on to you with my righteous right hand." You can't take anything away from these verses and plenty more besides, because there are a lot of scriptures in the Bible that do address the whole subject of anxiety and worry, and they do bring encouragement to us. However, having said that, I also want to say this in the very same breath. Yet we still find ourselves struggling with worry and anxiety. Would you agree to that? We still find ourselves struggling with it. Yeah, there's some verses and there's some very good, encouraging, positive verses in the Bible, and it's good to memorize these and to fall back on these. But we still find ourselves struggling in this area. I want to take today, what I want to do in this final message in this series is I want to take a couple of steps back and get a bigger picture view of what God's up to. I want, in what we're going to talk about today, I want to give you a little insight into how I think, in my opinion, how God works in these matters to help to grow us and to help us to overcome the anxiety that so many times has a grip on us. In some ways, it may seem like an unlikely place that I'm going to take you to, but I'm going to ask you, if you got your Bible, open it up way back in the Old Testament to the book of Exodus, chapters 14, 15, and 16. Obviously, I'm not going to be reading all of that. I will read portions of it, and I'll be summarizing other parts of it. But I think in the middle of all of this, in God's dealing with the children of Israel, that there are some things that we can take away from it, some principles that we can learn that's going to give us some good insight into how God wants to be able to help equip us, prepare us to be able to overcome things like anxiety. So going back here, let me summarize briefly chapter 14. I'm not going to read it, but in chapter 14, if you look at some of the headings in that chapter, you're going to see that it's talking about the Red Sea. This is after Israel had been in bondage for some 400 years in Egypt. It wasn't good. Life was harsh there in Egypt. They were slaves. But God sent Moses to deliver the people out of Egypt. And the 10 plagues and all of that ends up playing out. And so now Moses is leading Israel out, hundreds of thousands of people. In fact, that's just the number of men over a certain age. By the time you include women and children, we're not given an account in Scripture, but it's pretty easy to conclude that there had to have been 1.5 million, a couple of million people at least, that Moses is leading out of Egypt. Pharaoh finally has said uncle and said go. He had had enough through those 10 plagues. But they weren't too far out of town before Pharaoh changed his mind. And he sent his generals, his army, to go catch up to Israel and to bring them back. And so in chapter 14, we see Israel going up to the shoreline of the Red Sea. And of course, the dust of the Egyptian army isn't too far back behind them. And now the people are kind of like, what's going to happen now? Everyone's kind of wondering, what are we going to do? We don't have a boat to get on, and here we are at water's edge. We don't know what we're going to do. And it's at that moment in time that from God's instruction, Moses raises his staff and the parting of the Red Sea takes place. All of this is recorded in chapter 14. The parting of the Red Sea, two walls of water and dry land between these walls of water, and the Israelites, they're delivered through that, the parting of the Red Sea. And by the time they get to the other side, the Egyptian army is in the middle of the Red Sea, pursuing them. And that's when God causes the walls of water to collapse on them and they perish. And so as a result of all of that, you find this verse at the very tail end of chapter 14, the last verse of the chapter. It's very telling. It says this: when Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and believed in him and in his servant Moses. That's kind of the outcome of all of this great deliverance that God had brought to pass, freeing the people who had been in bondage for generations and destroying the Egyptian army. And the people are just in awe. There's a healthy reverence for God. It says they believe in the Lord. They believe in the Lord's servant Moses. I mean, it's a good verse. It's a positive verse at the ending of that whole incident. And then we go into chapter 15, and the bulk of chapter 15 records for us a celebration, songs. Moses is actually inspired to write a song. The first 18 verses of chapter 15 is all about the song. It's a long song. So that obviously means it's not a chorus. That's got to be a hymn. We don't have the music to it, but we got the lyrics right here. I mean, who has ever heard of a chorus with that many words in it? So that's got to be a hymn. So Moses is inspired, and he writes this long song, and he sings this song, and it's a song of celebration. Well, Moses' sister doesn't want to be outdone, and so we read in verse 21 that she's going to put her mind to it, and she writes a song as well. It's only 4 lines long, though, right? Okay, so that one's a chorus, okay? I mean, she probably sang it 5 or 6 times, because that's what you do with choruses, right? But so Moses wrote a hymn, and Miriam wrote a chorus, but the point of the matter is, regardless of the length and everything, it's a celebration of God's deliverance. God had stepped in on behalf of his people, the people of Israel, and he delivered them miraculously from bondage. And now we come to the closing verses of chapter 15, and this is where I want to start picking apart the scripture. I want us to take a closer look. I want you to notice what God does. The people have just been freed from oppression. They have just been freed from captivity. That's all they had known their entire lives. And that's all their parents knew, and their grandparents, and their great-grandparents. That's all they've known for the longest of time. But in a sense, there's still a form of captivity going on with them. They don't know it. They don't see it. But God does. In a sense, they're not truly free. Not yet. Even though they've been delivered and they're on the other side of the Red Sea. So after the Red Sea, what I want you to do is I want you to notice what God is doing. And let's start with verse 22. It says this: Then Moses led Israel on from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They traveled for 3 days in the wilderness without finding water. So they're traveling into the wilderness. Initially, when all the singing and celebrating is going on, they're right on the shoreline. They had just crossed, right there on the shoreline of the Red Sea. But now it's time to move inward, inland. And for 3 days, they do just that. They journey into the wilderness. And the wilderness is really desolate. Here's a modern day picture of what the wilderness of Shur looks like. There's lots and lots of sand. Some 250,000 square miles of sand in the wilderness of Shur. Okay, it's really desolate. They travel 3 days into all of that, getting deeper and deeper inland. And during that whole time, they don't find any water. Not a drop of water. Here's what I want you to get from what I believe is happening here, is God is helping them see that they need Him. I think there's something going on here, and I think God is helping to open their eyes in more than one way. One of the ways is God is helping them see that they indeed need Him. Yeah, He delivered them great deliverance through all the miracles, getting out of Egypt and across the Red Sea. But God's not done yet. He's wanting to help them see their need for Him. You see, there was something greater going on here than just journeying from point A to point B. From God's perspective, there was something greater, something more involved that was going on. Now, if you asked any of them, they would have said something to the effect of, well, yeah, we're traveling from here to Mount Sinai. That's where they got the Ten Commandments. Or we're traveling from here to the Promised Land. Yeah, they would have given some kind of a response like that. But no, that God knows this is more involved than that. What I suggest to you is that it is likely that He's doing the same thing in your life as what we're going to be looking at here. You may, in your mind's eye, you may have a plan for your life. And you may be in the middle of executing that plan. You may have short-term goals that you're trying to achieve in the next few months or the next year or two. And you may have long-range goals that even stretch out 10, 15, 20 years from now. You have a plan for your life, and you are in the process of executing that plan. But what I suggest to you is that God looks at that, and He's not just a part of helping you to execute your plan. He has a plan for your life. And along the way, there's going to be some things that are going to happen that weren't written into the script of your plan. But it's because of God's greater plan, His deeper plan that He has for you. So just keep that in mind as we're going through this. Imagine 3 days without any water. By this particular point in time, their canteens were empty, right? I mean, whatever water they were carrying with them after 3 days, it's pretty much gone now. But then they spot some water, and that's verse 23. They came to Marah, but they could not drink the water at Marah because it was bitter. That is why it is named Marah. The word Marah just simply means, literally, bitter. Yeah, initially, and there's some other passages that talk about this water, several springs of water, perhaps some pools or a couple of lakes or something or other were a part of all that. And so I would imagine people's hopes got up as soon as they spotted the water and they started running to the water. But by the time they get there, it's quickly discovered that this water is not drinkable. So you stop and you think about it. They've been traveling for 3 days in this wilderness, and all they're seeing is sand and the hot wind blowing in their face. And their canteens are running dry. And so fear is starting to kick into gear. Now they see the promise of water. They run and find out that the water, you can't even drink it. So now you couple the fear that they were starting to experience, and you add to that disappointment. And what do you end up with? You end up with some real anxiety that's going on. It doesn't take much of an imagination to envision what's happening here and what they're experiencing emotionally. And then we come to verse 24. It says, the people grumbled to Moses, what are we going to drink? If there was any doubt what emotionally was going on inside of them, now there's no doubt. I mean, God knew it all along. God knew that there was still something going on here inside their hearts. But basically, what God is doing is He's exposing it to them. And that's why I say, not only is God helping them see that they need Him, but here we see that He's showing them how afraid they really are. And really, that's what grumbling and complaining and belly aching and all of that, whatever designation you want to give that, it's all part of an expression of anxiety, of fear. And so now, if there was any doubt at all that there was fear going on, still having a grip on them, it's been exposed. Their fear was surfacing in some pretty obvious ways. But then again, I think that was God's plan. God knew it, but He wanted them to know it. He wanted them to know about their lack of faith. He wanted to expose it so all of them could see it. God was helping them to see their own hearts. I mean, where was their faith? Remember what happened just just 3 days earlier. Remember what was happening? Let me show you that verse again. Remember this? This was right after the parting of the Red Sea, and they were delivered, and the Egyptian army drowned in the Red Sea. Remember all that? And remember the inspiration that came from this immediately for the next 19 or 20 verses was all about singing songs of celebration. And it's talking about how they had faith in God and they had faith in God's servant. That was only 3 days earlier. Where is their faith gone? Their faith is totally overcome with fear at this point in time. And I don't think that was a huge surprise to God because God knew it was there all along, but He wanted them to know it. And so then we come to verse 25. It says, so he cried out to the Lord. This is talking about Moses. And the Lord showed him a tree. When he threw it into the water, this is the water at Marah, he threw it into the water, and the water became drinkable. He made a statute, an ordinance for them at Marah, and he tested them there. I think that's rather significant. You notice the word test? I've bolded it so that hopefully you would notice it. And the reason why is because of this. I believe there's more going on here than first meets the eye. I mean, because you look at the surface of it, and what's their need? Their need is they need a glass of water. Isn't that it? That's the need, period. I mean, if you just look at it on purely a superficial level, that's what it seems like the need is. They need some water. They need a glass of water. They need their canteens filled again. But God knew there was a greater need here. And so that's why we're reading the word tested. There's something else at play. There's something else that God is up to. Now we're ready for verse 26. He said, if you will carefully obey the Lord your God and do what is right in His eyes, pay attention to His commands, and keep all of His statutes, I will not inflict any illnesses on you that I inflicted on the Egyptians, for I am Yahweh who heals you. Okay, well, what's all this got to do with needing some water? Well, again, He's leading to something that they need to know. Notice that that last sentence especially says, this is God speaking, for I am Yahweh who heals you. That's a pretty significant statement. And that leads me to say this. Not only was God helping them to see that they needed Him, but He was also showing them how afraid they really are. And then He's offering them a solution. And what is the solution? I am Yahweh, the healer. The actual word in the Hebrew is basically what is being stated there at the very end of verse 26 is, I am Yahweh Rapha. That's the actual word, the Hebrew word that is used. I am Yahweh Rapha. That's one of the titles of God. It's one of the titles of God, the names of God, that God takes on Himself. I am Yahweh Rapha. And what that means literally is, I am God the healer. And what you're reading is the translation of the name that God was referencing himself with. I am God, the healer. They wanted water. And God, though, says, I am the healer. You see, their need was greater than what they even realized. It involved more. Here's something that you and we need to know. And this may not be something we like the sound of, okay? I'll preface it by saying that. We may not like the sound of this, but we need to know this. When we are in the middle of a situation, a bad situation, a desperate situation, when we're between a rock and a hard place, and we're really struggling, when we're in the middle of a situation like that, God rarely just removes it. We don't like the sound of that because we want God to just remove it. But the truth of the matter is God rarely does. Think back over some of you have lived long enough, think back over your life and some of the situations and the negative, difficult times that you've had, whether it was financially or some job or relationship-wise or health-wise. I mean, how often did God just swoop in and boom, everything's all better and right side up? The truth of the matter is God rarely just does it like that. But there's a reason behind it. It's because he's usually trying to do a deeper work in our lives beyond the obvious. And this really is not this is not anyone's favorite comment. And I've made this comment before, and I'm going to make it now. Your comfort is not God's number one concern in life. We just don't like the sound of that. Because so many times the way we operate in life is that it is. Our and our family's comfort is what matters most. But from God's perspective, your comfort in the here and now, this temporary realm that you're in, that's not God's number one concern for you. So what is this deeper work as we're reading the text here? If it wasn't water, providing them water and filling their canteens again, if it was something more than that, what is it? Well, that's what chapter 16 is going to give us some keen insight into. So let's read the opening verses of chapter 16. It says, the entire Israelite community departed from Elim and came to the wilderness of Sin. Now, don't read too much into that. It's not wilderness of sin as in wilderness of transgression, of evil deeds or something. Just think of sin as being short for Sinai, okay? So that's part of just what this region was named. And so it says the entire Israelite community departed from Elim and came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month, after they had left the land of Egypt. The entire Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by pots of meat and ate all the bread that we wanted. Instead, you brought us into this wilderness to make this whole assembly die of hunger. Okay, so we're going to start seeing God's plan really unfolding here. It's basically been a month since they left Egypt, based on what verse 1 is telling us as far as the date and all. It's basically been about 4 weeks, give or take, since they left Egypt. So not only did they have the challenge 3 days following the Red Sea as far as running short on water, now, over 3.5 weeks later, food supply is running low. Totally logical. I mean, you totally understand that. That big of a group of people, surely they were carrying food in a variety of ways. But they're a month into this journey, and so food supplies are running dangerously low, or maybe they've totally run out entirely. And the text tells us that now they're not in the wilderness of Shur, they're in the wilderness of Sin. So is that different? Well, let me show you a modern day picture of the wilderness of Sin. Yeah, it's not much different. Okay? I mean, just lots of sand. Miles and miles and miles of sand. But this is what we're reading in the text. In verses 2 and 3 that I read, it says the entire Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And they said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt when we sat by pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted. Boy, that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? We sat by pots of meat and ate all the bread. I mean, it was like a buffet. We had all we wanted to eat whenever we wanted it. All of this kinds of bread. You like rye bread? There's plenty of it. You like sourdough bread? There's plenty of it. You like 12-grain bread? There's plenty of it. I mean, that's kind of what they're saying here. They had all these pots of meat, and they got all of this bread, all we wanted. Instead, you brought us into this wilderness to make this whole assembly die of hunger. Here's the thing, and I've pointed this out earlier in the series, but this is what worry does to a person. It distorts your perspective on things. And it really does a number with your memory. You know, these guys, they were slaves. They were being harshly treated in Egypt. But now they're thinking of, man, life in Egypt was like one continuous golden corral. I mean, we had everything we wanted. Yeah, right. That wasn't true. Moses and Aaron knew that wasn't true. Deep down inside, the people knew it, but like I say, anxiety's got a grip on them now. And you know, the thing is, because you're going to, you know, as we go into verse 4 and following, you're going to look at this and say, well, it's kind of like a prayer. Man, this is a very poor prayer if it's a prayer. They're really not asking for anything. They're just belly aching. They're complaining about their situation. To be truthful, ultimately, they're holding God in contempt for their situation. It doesn't specifically spell that out here. It gives the impression that it's all the crosshairs are set on Aaron and Moses. But before we're done here, pretty soon, we're going to see a verse just a few verses down where it's clear that who they were really complaining against was God. It wasn't Moses. It wasn't Aaron. But here's the incredible thing. After all of that, what do we see in verse 4? We see that God listens to them. In verse 4 it says, then the Lord said to Moses, I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you. It's incredible. God's, after all this belly aching and all this stuff, fear has got control of them and distorting everything as far as their memory and all of this kind of stuff. But this is God's response to that. God listens to them. God hears them. On the basis of pure grace, God's going to reach out. And he's going to do something to alleviate their suffering. It wasn't deserved. I mean, what God's doing, he's not doing it because they deserve it. I mean, they haven't expressed any gratitude since, a month ago when they sang the songs that Moses and Miriam came up with. Otherwise, there's been no gratitude or anything here. It's all been a matter of complaining. And like I said, these complaints weren't even just directed at Moses. They were directed at God. Look at the second half of verse 8. It says that he, talking about God, he has heard the complaints that you're raising against him. Who are we? Your complaints are not against us, but against the Lord. See, Moses recognized that all this complaining and everything, it was all being directed toward God. God knew that as well, but yet as an act of pure grace, God's going to do something about it to alleviate their suffering. No wonder Peter said this, and we've looked at this in an earlier message. He said, cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7. Now, that's really not what they were doing in verses 2 and 3. They were just belly aching. But yet, no wonder Peter says this, because we have a God who does care when we're hurting. But, as I've already indicated more than once, God is doing more here than just giving them a meal. Yeah, he's doing more than just giving them a meal. Look at verses 4 and 5. Then the Lord said to Moses, I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. This way I will test them to see whether or not they will follow my instructions. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on the other days. And that's because the seventh day is the Sabbath day, and they weren't to go out and gather bread. Now, it's talking about manna here. The word manna isn't used. It isn't going to be until later in the chapter that the word manna actually starts being used. Right now, they're just talking about this as being some type of a bread that's being provided for them. But I want you to notice what's in the middle of that passage that is on the screen. You see it? I've bolded it again. It's the word test. That means that there's more going on here than what you see at first glance. It's not just a matter of earlier filling their canteen with water and now putting some food in their backpack for them to eat. No, there's something more going on here. What is it that God is doing? Now we're really finally, at this point in time in the message, we're finally getting to the heart of what and why I took you to this portion of Scripture in view of our series. Okay, now we're getting to the heart of the matter. What's going on here? God begins training them to trust Him. This really is the bottom line of what's happening here. So many of us have heard the story of the manna and how God provided manna. And of course, they didn't even know how long it was going to be. But we know in hindsight, it lasted for 40 years. Every day, God was providing them with manna. I know the Sabbath day and all, but technically speaking, every day there was manna miraculously being provided for them. But what was it God ultimately was accomplishing? He was training them to trust Him. That's what was going on. Let's look at verse 4 a little closer, and let's look at it from the New American Standard translation. This actually is a translation that I always use when I'm preparing lessons and all. It's one of the most literal word-for-word translations, Hebrew and Greek, of the original text. And here's what it says, Exodus 16, verse 4. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them, whether or not they will walk in my instruction." Now, I've underlined that phrase, a day's portion every day. A day's portion every day. Now, I know on the sixth day they gathered 2 days' portions because they weren't going to go out on the Sabbath. But still, the principle is here. A day's portion every day. And what I would like to say as we expand on this just a little bit is I would like to suggest to you that I believe this is still how God operates today. Yeah, I know this is way back when. I mean, this is thousands of years ago that this all was happening. But I think God still operates the same way. A day's portion every day. Let me say it like this, and here it is. Here is the manna principle right here. God gives us all we need every day for that day, and then He begins again. Just think about that. Because that's actually what that's what God was setting up. Something that was going to be carried out for 4 decades. There's a lot of days involved in that. I didn't even do the math, but there's a lot of days involved with that. 365 days a year for times, multiply that by 40. But the lesson that He was driving home to people is that God gives us all we need every day for that day. And then He begins it again. There are specific things that I'm not going to be referring to because of time in chapter 16 where it tells the exact amount that you were to gather for each family member. When you go out there in the morning. No more, no less. That amount, that should cover your needs for this day. Say this day is Monday, all right? Then on Tuesday, you go out and you gather that amount, and that'll cover your needs for Tuesday. On Wednesday, you go out, because you don't have anything left over. On Wednesday, you go out and you gather what you need to cover your needs for that day. That's the principle. God gives us all we need every day for that day, and then He begins again. We just kind of take for granted some things here because we've heard the story of God providing manna for 40 years and all of this stuff, and their clothes didn't wear out and all. And, we look at this story and we just kind of in a sweeping, quick fashion, we just kind of look at it, God miraculously provided them food in the middle of all that. All right, now let's move on, And we don't really hover over it very long. But the principle is there. God was meeting their basic needs for that day. Not for that day and the next 3 or 4 days, for that day. And then the next day, he would address their needs for that day. And perhaps this is even part of what Jesus was touching on in the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer in Matthew chapter 6, verse 11, where he says, give us this day our daily bread. Talking about what are my basic needs right now. God, provide for my basic needs right now. Because that's basically the approach God was taking with the children of Israel so many years earlier. There were specific instructions attached to all this, not only that you were to gather a set amount, but that if you gathered more than that, then no, it doesn't work that way. You shouldn't do that. Well, guess what? People gathered more than that. A lot of people thought, well, let's just get a little extra. That won't hurt. What did they discover that next morning with the extra that they had on hand? It smelled and it was full of maggots. Yeah, it was good for nothing. Yeah, specific instructions. This was a brand new kind of food. Let me add that to the equation here too. This wasn't a kind of food that they had been exposed to before. In fact, that's what it's basically saying in verses 14 and 15. It says, when the layer of dew evaporated, there were fine flakes on the desert surface, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they asked one another, what is it? Because they didn't know what it was. Moses told them, it is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. They didn't even have a name for it. What is this stuff? None of us have ever seen this before. Now, I would have assumed that just by looking at verse 4, look at it there. It says, fine flakes, as fine as frost on the ground. It sounds like frosted flakes to me. That designation should have worked. We have frosted flakes God has given us. But for whatever reason, they apparently, if they put it to a vote, that one didn't get very many votes. Instead, the name they give it to, way down in verse 31, we read this. It says, the house of Israel named the substance manna. It resembled coriander seed, was white, and tasted like wafers made with honey. You know what the word manna means? It just literally means, what is it? That's what it means. That was the name they gave this food because nobody had ever seen it before. Okay, well, that sounds good. Let's just call it that. What is it? Did you go gather the what is it today? Yeah, I just had a fresh batch of what is it, Tomorrow, can we deep fry some what is it, And, what is it? That was the name of the food. But why a brand new food? Why did God create a brand new food for the people? I think it was so that they couldn't go about explaining this in any other way. I think it was something brand new so that no one would try to connect dots and come up with a different theory as to how this all came about. Like the Discovery Channel or something would come up with a natural explanation. There was no natural explanation for this. And so God, to keep people with question marks in their mind, said, I'm going to invent a brand new food they've never seen before. You see, here's what's happening. God was training them. Here in the barren wilderness, God was training them to trust Him each and every day. That's what's happening here. Had they been able to store away 10 tons of this stuff in cold storage, like all this stuff appears on the ground, and it's like, hey, let's get this going. Bring the Bobcat over here. Let's scoop up a bunch of this and put it in this little storage shed that we've built over here. And if they would have been able to store away 10 tons, guess what would have ended up happening? By that afternoon, they would have been forgetting about God. because now they would have become self-reliant. We got ourselves covered. We're taking care of ourselves. We got plenty of food. Yeah, I think very much so. That's the reason why this stuff spoiled every morning, is because God was all about training them in regards to something very important. They needed everyday practice in trusting God. And so that's what was happening. And it happened for 365 days times 40 years. Everyday practice. You know as well as I do, we're so prone to forget. We are so prone to forget God's provisions. I mean, what was their situation we looked at earlier? Just after 3 days, weren't they forgetting all about the parting of the Red Sea and all this kind of stuff? We are so prone to forget. Lessons that we learned yesterday don't always get carried over into today. And I think most all of us in here would be in agreement with that. God's not trying to play some kind of a game with the people. Rather, instead, what is happening here is God is forging a relationship with his people. That's what's playing out. It served as a daily reminder of God's presence, a daily reminder of God's watchful care. God's plan was to give the people what they needed when they needed it, and not necessarily before. God gives us all we need every day for that day, and then he begins again. Now you fast forward 40 years, most of the entire generation has now died off. The kids have all grown up, and now they're the adults, and Moses is a very old man, and Moses is recalling of the events that started some 40 years earlier when he says this in Deuteronomy chapter 8. He says, he gave you manna to eat in the wilderness, something your ancestors had never known, to humble and test you, so that in the end it might go well with you. You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth. You see, it was all about training them and humbling them. This passage communicates a lot. God's intent through all of this was to draw people closer to himself. That's what God was doing. And like I said, this isn't just a history lesson. I believe indeed that this is how God works. And it very well may explain what is happening in your life right now. You may be struggling with this or that situation, and it just seems to be dragging out. And it's just like, why? God's fully capable. He's got the power. He's got the ability to totally snatch this out of my life so I don't have to deal with this anymore, right? You've thought that, right? Absolutely, you've thought that. We all have at one point in time or another. This helps us to understand why God doesn't just swoop in and remove it, because there's something in a grander scheme. There's a plan that he has. And that plan has everything to do with drawing you closer to him, forging a relationship with him. And if God could do that with a couple of million people back then, he can do that with you today. Yeah, maybe God hasn't swooped in and delivered you from whatever the situation is. But what he does do is he gives you the strength needed to sustain you in the middle of whatever the ordeal is that you're battling with. You're not going to find promises in the Bible that spell out that God promises he will deliver you out of whatever negative situation you find yourself in. You're not going to find promises that say God will deliver you out of whatever adversity you're going through. But you're going to find passages of Scripture that say that God will take you through it. And God will be with you every step of the way. God will empower you. He will strengthen you. He will comfort you. He will heal you. He is the healer. You don't have to face it alone. Whatever it is that you're going through, whatever it is that's got a grip on you and it's stirring up so much anxiety in your life, you don't have to face it alone. His comfort, his presence, His watchful care will be with you every step of the way. I want you to think about it like this. In a sense, as we look at this story way back here, tucked away in the Old Testament, God was saving them every single day through the provision of manna. In a sense, that's true. God was saving them every single day by miraculously providing the manna for them all those years. No wonder it's repeatedly referred to throughout the Bible. You will see passages that talk about those miraculous days of the manna provision that was made. And all through the Scripture, you see references to it, and it all kind of culminates in John chapter 6. In John chapter 6, Jesus fed the multitude. Remember that? The 5 loaves and the 2 fish? He fed a multitude, 5,000 men. Add to that women and children, okay, big crowd of people. He miraculously fed them. And then during the night, Jesus, he crossed over the Sea of Galilee. The next day, the people hunt him down, and they find him on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And what do they immediately start appealing to him for? They're saying, can you give us a sign, right? John chapter 6. Can you give us a sign so that we can believe you are who you claim to be? Can you give us a sign? You remember how Moses gave manna to the people way back when, in the days of the wilderness. Remember Moses? He gave manna for the people to eat. Jesus, you remember that? Can you give us a sign? Moses gave manna to the hint. I mean, that's kind of what they're doing. It's like their bellies are empty. It was yesterday Jesus fed them. They're wanting another meal today. And so they're all about, what is the sign you're going to give us? How about manna? That would be a good idea. Give us some food here. But Jesus' response to all of that is recorded here in verses 32 to 35. Jesus said to them, I assure you, Moses didn't give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the real bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the one who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Then they said, Sir, give us this bread always. And Jesus told them, I am the bread of life. That's the story of the Bible. This is the story that's found all through the Bible. God cares. And because of that, God provides what we need when we need it. Whether that was manna way back then, or water way back then, or whether that was Calvary and Jesus' death on the cross. God cares, and because of that, he provides what we need when we need it. The thing that I want you to remember as our ushers prepare for communion, I want you to remember this. The lesson that we take away from this is that God is watching out for you. That's one of the bottom line messages here, is that God is watching out for you. You are in good hands. You don't need to be ruled by fear. Whatever it is that's happening in your life that's stirring up anxiety, and it's just stirring all of this fear and everything that's got such a grip on you, you don't have to be ruled by fear, because God has got your back. And that's what we learn from passages like this. Whether it be way back in Exodus with the manna that was provided, or it's way over in the Gospels with the Son of God being crucified on the cross on your behalf. God has got your back. That's the kind of God we serve. A God that does for us what we don't deserve, but he's moved by pure grace to do for us what we need the most. So let's remember that the next time we're tempted to fret and to worry about this present situation that's going on in our life. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the opportunity today to talk about a passage of Scripture that most of us that are in this room we're familiar with. We've read it, we've heard the stories about it multiple times. But perhaps today we've kind of seen it from a different angle, one that we haven't considered before. And indeed, Lord, there is a lesson to be learned there. We're thankful that you are a God who cares. Even during the times of our stubborn pride and our unbelief, yet you're a God that still hears us and reaches out to help us, even though we don't deserve it. And Father, we'll be reminded of that very clearly in just a few seconds while we take the bread and we eat it, and we take the cup and we drink it, and we're reminded of the body and the blood of your Son, Jesus. How you provided for us in addressing the greatest need of all, the need of being forgiven of our sin. Father, forgive us for those times we take it all for granted and we have such short memories. Thank you for being a God who loves us so much that you would do the incredible, including sending your Son Jesus to die so that we might live.